off the stage before you embarrass us any further! You don't belong here, ruining this evening for everyone! Julian completely blew the deal! Marcus refused the pitch, stopped the presentation, and demanded to speak to you now!
Your daughter is our senior managing partner, who wrote the investment terms and holds 51% of debt.
You spent years telling me I belonged in the background, so while you showcased Julian, I bought your entire company.
Get off the stage before you embarrass us any further. You don't belong here, and frankly, you're ruining the entire evening for everyone who actually matters. My father's voice echoed off the marble walls of the grand ballroom, amplified by the heavy silence of 200 distinguished guests. Beside him, my stepmother smirked, crossing her arms in her emerald silk dress, looking down at me as if I were dirt tracked across a white carpet. My stepbrother didn't even hide his sneer. He raised his champagne glass in a mock toast to my public humiliation. The waiters froze. The investors stopped talking. Every pair of eyes in that room was pinned on me as my father signaled for security to drag me out of the building. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply adjusted my coat, looked my father dead in the eye, and walked out the heavy glass doors into the rain. To understand how we reached that shattering point, you have to rewind just 3 months. My father, Arthur, was the CEO of Vance Logistics, a legacy firm that was rapidly bleeding cash due to years of atrocious management, nepotism, and reckless vanity projects pushed by my stepbrother Julian. When my biological mother passed away 5 years ago, Arthur remarried within 6 months. His new wife, Evelyn, made it her personal mission to erase every trace of my mother and me from Arthur's life. Overnight, I went from being the heir apparent to the family black sheep. I was 26, quietly working as a mid-level supply chain analyst at a firm they assumed was a small regional operation. To my father and Evelyn, I was a failure, a disappointment who didn't fit their lavish, high society aesthetic. Evelyn would tell me over Sunday dinners that I just didn't have the polish for upper management, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. She insisted Julian had the charismatic spark, while I was better suited for behind-the-scenes work, strictly out of sight. I never argued with her. I never whined to my dad. When they cut off my trust fund to fund Julian's luxury sports car habit, I smiled and signed the paperwork. When they stopped inviting me to family holidays, I politely sent flowers and stayed home. They thought I was weak. They thought my silence was submission. But they had absolutely no idea what was brewing just beneath the surface. 3 weeks ago, Vance Logistics hit rock bottom. Their credit lines were maxed out, and they were weeks away from bankruptcy. Their absolute last lifeline was a massive, multi-million-dollar buyout and restructuring contract from Apex Global Holdings, the largest private equity firm in the country. Securing Apex's backing would save Vance Logistics and turn Arthur into a multi-millionaire overnight. To seal the deal, my father and Evelyn planned a lavish black-tie gala at the St. Regis. Every major investor, board member, and tech leader in the state was invited. It was designed to be Julian's grand debut as the new vice president of operations. 2 days before the event, I hadn't received an invitation. I called my father to ask if he needed me there to help navigate the supply chain data for the investors. He sighed heavily into the receiver, explaining that it was a very high-stakes evening with important people and that Evelyn and he felt it just wasn't my place. He told me I would feel out of my element and that I should just stay home. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text from Evelyn. She reiterated the black-tie dress code, mentioned the new investors, and told me it just wasn't my scene, wishing me a quiet night at home. Silence from me. Absence followed. I didn't text back. I didn't throw a tantrum. I simply typed a brief reply to an email sitting in my inbox, poured myself a cup of tea, and waited. At 8:30 p.m. on the night of the gala, I was sitting comfortably on my couch in my cozy fleece pajamas, watching a movie, when my phone began to vibrate violently on the coffee table. It was my father. I let it ring until the last second before answering. "Where are you?" Arthur roared into the receiver. The background noise of the gala was deafening. Clinking glasses, murmuring crowds, and underlying panic in my father's heavy breathing. "At home, Dad," I replied calmly, sipping my tea. "Like you and Evelyn asked." "Cut the crap!" he screamed, his voice breaking. Julian completely blew the pitch to Marcus Vance. Marcus refused to look at the financial forecast Julian prepared. He took one look at our operations pitch, called it amateur hour, and threatened to pull Apex out of the deal entirely. Marcus Vance, no relation to us, was the notoriously ruthless chairman of Apex Global Holdings. He held my family's entire financial future in his hands. I told my father I was sorry to hear that, keeping my tone perfectly mild. "He wants your input," Arthur yelled, sounding like he was on the verge of a massive heart attack. Marcus stopped the entire presentation, looked at the board, and demanded to speak to you directly. Dad roared into the mic, completely baffled and enraged. On what? There was a brief beat of silence on the line, as the phone was clearly snatched out of my father's hand. A smooth, calm, deeply authoritative voice spoke into the receiver. The investor answered, "On whether or not I fire your entire board and liquidize your company tonight, Arthur. Seeing as your daughter is the senior managing partner at Apex Global, who wrote our investment terms, she holds 51% of your firm's voting debt." Silence hung in the air like a suffocating blanket. On the other end of the line, I heard my father swallow hard, stammering in total disbelief. His voice was stripped of all its former arrogance. They had spent 5 years assuming I was working a dead-end corporate job. They never bothered to read my business cards. They never looked up the corporate filings of Apex's newly acquired logistics arm. They saw what they wanted to see, a quiet girl who wouldn't fight back. When my mother passed, she didn't leave me money. She left me her minority share in an obscure tech incubator. Over 5 years, I worked 16-hour days, poured every ounce of my soul into building supply chain algorithms, and quietly brokered a merger with Apex Global. I didn't just work at Apex. I helped build their logistics division. And 3 days ago, when Vance Logistics applied for the bailout, I personally purchased their distressed debt. I owned them. I asked Marcus to put my father on speakerphone and stood up to open my laptop. My voice was crisp, cold, and echoed through the St. Regis Ballroom speakerphone. I reminded my father that he told me this event wasn't my place, that I didn't fit in with his important people. Well, those important people were currently waiting for my signature to save his life's work. Evelyn's voice squeaked in the background, suddenly full of terror, begging that it was just a misunderstanding to spare me stress. I cut her off instantly and asked Marcus if my stepbrother Julian had prepared the operational forecast. When Marcus confirmed it was full of fabricated margins and impossible delivery projections, I stated plainly that as per Clause 9 of the Debt Acquisition Agreement, fraudulent reporting triggers immediate acceleration of the loan. Vance Logistics was officially in breach. Gasps erupted across the ballroom. I could hear whispers spreading like wildfire among the city's elite. My father's lifelong peers were watching him crumble in real time. He begged me, his voice trembling, pleading that we were family and not to do this to my brother. I told him it wasn't personal, it was just business, the exact phrase he used when he cut off my mother's estate access. I reminded him that he spent years telling me I belonged in the background, so I stayed there, and while he was busy showcasing Julian, I bought the floor they were standing on. The dominoes fell with terrifying speed. By 9 a.m. the next morning, Apex Global officially exercised its right to foreclose on Vance Logistics' debt. Because Julian had signed off on the falsified financial forecasts, Apex's legal team filed an immediate corporate audit. Within 48 hours, forensic accountants uncovered that Julian had embezzled over $400,000 from the company's emergency reserves to cover his personal gambling debts and sports car leases. The board of directors instantly revolted. In an emergency meeting, they voted unanimously to strip Arthur of his CEO title and terminate Julian effective immediately. With no income, an impending federal fraud investigation, and millions in personal guarantees tied to the company's failed loans, my father was forced to liquidate his estate. The luxury mansion, the country club memberships, the sports cars, all of it went to the auction block to pay off creditors. Evelyn, seeing the ship sinking, filed for divorce within 2 weeks, taking what little personal assets she had left and leaving my father alone in a rented one-bedroom apartment. Julian was formally indicted on corporate fraud charges and is currently awaiting trial, facing up to 6 years in state prison. 2 months after the gala, Apex Global officially took over the assets of Vance Logistics. We rebranded the company, restructured the supply chain, and preserved the jobs of the 300 everyday workers who had done nothing wrong. On the day of the company relaunch, I stood in the top-floor executive suite that used to belong to my father. My assistant walked in and handed me a letter. It was from Arthur, written on plain notebook paper, begging for a meeting, apologizing for how he treated me, and asking for financial help. I didn't tear it up in anger. I didn't laugh. I simply folded it neatly, placed it in my drawer, and looked out the window over the city skyline. I didn't feel hatred. I just felt peace. They thought my silence was weakness. They learned too late that the quietest person in the room is often the one holding all the cards. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were dealing with? Tell me your story in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more revenge stories every week.